Bonjour, je m'appelle Sophie Mathieu. My name is Sophie Mathieu. I'm from Quebec. I'm delighted to be here and to be right after Gordon, although it's always impressive to be after Gordon. But I will echo some of the concerns and questions that he raised regarding for-profit childcare by talking more specifically about Quebec, the Quebec model. If you can go back to the previous slide. Well, it's fine. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of a roadmap of what I'll be talking in a few minutes, I'll start by talking about the Quebec model in a historical perspective to really say a few words about how did we get there, because the Quebec model currently is being it's not as good as it used to be. Then I'll be talking about where we are at in 2024 with the for-profit and the non-profit childcare centers. And I'll be talking about affordability, accessibility, but mostly quality. Again, I will echo some of the things that Gordon just talked about. And I'll end my presentation by talking about the Grand Chantier pour les familles, which is Quebec's initiative to complete its childcare network. So a few words about the Quebec model in a historical perspective. As you know, childcare is heavily subsidized in Quebec, heavily subsidized. We have a mixed system, and we have been living with both non-profit and for-profit childcare centers, which has been confusing for many parents. When people think about the Quebec model, they usually think about the CPEs, the Centre de la Petite Enfance, which are the non-profit and higher quality childcare centers. Currently, the CPEs offer spaces in 2024 at $9.10 a day. Now, subsidized childcare, for-profit subsidized garderie, also offer childcare spaces at the same cost as the CPE. So it's confusing for parents because as long as they pay the same amount, they just assume that their child is enrolled in a CPE, which is often not the case, that we'll see in a few minutes. And finally, we have unsubsidized and for-profit garderie, which is rarely the parent's first choice, but because of lack of spaces in the subsidized childcare centers, some parents must rely on those garderies. And for those garderies, for those childcare centers, parents get a portion of their fees reimbursed through taxation. Now, if we go back into the 1997 policy, when the 1997 family policy was introduced, the plan was really to offer all childcare spaces within the Centre de la Petite Enfance, the CPEs. There was even a 5-year moratorium on the creation of childcare spaces in the for-profit garderie. What happened after that? Well, 2003, it's the end of the moratorium. There's a lot of pressure to create new spaces because the program is really popular, and we have a new government in place, the Liberals, which will open the door wide to the for-profit garderie. So after the end of the moratorium, there were incentives for parents to use the for-profit unsubsidized childcare under the form of reimbursement for part of the fees, an advance reimbursement, so you can get the money before you have to pay for your childcare centers. So now for a certain proportion of families, it costs exactly the same to attend a CPE or even an unsubsidized childcare center. Now, in 2024, this is what really the government wants you to know. The government wants you to know that most childcare spaces in Quebec is subsidized. In Quebec, roughly 66% of preschoolers are enrolled in regulated childcare, and out of those 65.6%, 78.6% are enrolled in subsidized childcare without whether a CPE or subsidized garderie. So this is really what the official story is, and it's a good story to say that, you know, most children who are enrolled in a childcare center, their parents don't pay that much, but we'll really look at what the numbers say. It's not as good as it seems. So if we look at how childcare is being delivered in facilities, if you look at 2003, 70% of all childcare spaces that were offered in facilities were offered by the nonprofit CPEs. So right before the Liberals came into power, really, like, the CPEs were at the heart of the Quebec model. But then, with the end of the moratorium, the incentives for the parents to use the for-profit unsubsidized childcare space, we saw the proportion of childcare spaces being offered by the CPEs decreasing. So today, in 2023, the latest available data, it's only 46.2 of childcare spaces that are offered in facilities that are offered by the CPEs. And of course, this is only like childcare spaces that are offered in centers. But in Quebec, as in the other provinces, we also have, I don't want to click, spaces that are offered in family environment, and they are not accounted for here. Now, when we look at where children are located, because again, when people think of the Quebec model, they really think of the CPEs. So what is usually reported is that roughly 35.3% of childcare spaces are offered by the CPEs. Okay, but what does it really look like when you look at the percentage of kids who attend the CPEs? And this is the story that we don't hear very often in Quebec. When you really look at the percentage of preschoolers that are enrolled in the CPE, we're looking at 23%. So that means that most kids are not enrolled in a nonprofit childcare. Most kids are actually enrolled in a for-profit subsidized center, garderie, whether it's subsidized or not. So 41.1% of childcare spaces are provided by the garderie. So that means that there are a higher proportion of children that are enrolled in a for-profit than in the CPE. Now, we've already addressed some of the issues with the for-profit childcare. In Quebec, affordability is not as much of an issue because many of the for-profit garderies offer subsidized childcare space. And also, I should mention that in the latest budget, there was a commitment by the government that was reaffirmed that we really want to offer subsidized childcare to every families without ever making it a right. But there is a commitment from the government to offer subsidized, but not nonprofit, not CPE, subsidized, so the affordable childcare. Accessibility is an issue very much in Quebec. We have long waiting lists. So if we look at the latest data from the Ministère de la Famille, in October 2023, there were more than 30,000 children who were on the waiting list, and there was an additional 30,000 children that needed a space after October. So it's really hard to get a good grasp on the number of children that are on the waiting list. It ranges between 30 and 80,000 children, but the government is committed to creating 37,000 new childcare spaces. I'll talk about it in a few minutes, before the end of 2025. Now, in terms of the quality, we've known for many years that quality is not excellent in Quebec. There has been couple of months ago, new release from the Ministère de la Famille, which show that 89% of CPEs, but only 53% of unsubsidized garderies have reached the minimum threshold on 4 quality indicators. So interactions, physical environment, quality of activity planning, and quality of interactions with parents. So the CPEs, I'm sure this is not a surprise, the nonprofit is doing better in terms of quality. So I also want to say a few things about our educational childcare regulation, because our educational childcare regulation states that 2 out of 3 childcare educators need to be qualified in childcare facilities. But when we look at the percentage of childcare centers that comply with that rule, we see a very different picture in the CPEs and in the unsubsidized garderies. So in 2018, 92% of the nonprofit CPEs had 2 out of their 3 childcare educators that were fully trained, but only 33% of unsubsidized childcare centers. So there's a huge difference in what the percentage of trained childcare workers in both types of centers. Now, with the pandemic, the educational childcare regulation was relaxed because so many childcare educators left the field, and the government really wanted to push and try to recruit more. So before the pandemic, it used to be the case that 2 out of 3 childcare educators need to be fully trained. It was reduced to a ratio of 1 to 2 childcare workers, 1 out of 3 and then 1 out of 2, and now we're back to the same original ratio. But of course, nobody has a magic wand, and a lot of trained childcare workers left the field during the pandemic. So since 2021, there is roughly 6,000 childcare educators that left the field, 52% of whom were fully trained. They were replaced by only 42% of fully trained childcare educators. So the fully trained childcare educators are leaving the field and are being replaced with new educators that are not fully trained. And that translates into the fact that we went from having 72% to 68% of qualified childcare workers in the field. Now, I want to say a few words about Québec's plan to complete its network, le Grand Chantier pour les familles, because there's currently no commitment from the Quebec government to create more spaces in the CPEs. With the Grand Chantier des Familles, the commitment is really to create 37 additional new spaces by the end of 2025. It's not going to happen. We're already behind, despite efforts by the Minister de la Famille. And something that was very interesting a couple of days ago, in 2024-2025 budget, the CPEs were not mentioned even once in the 434 pages. But again, there was a strong commitment that was reaffirmed a few times that the government would gradually convert non-subsidized spaces into in the network into subsidized spaces. So this is really what the government is trying to do without really paying as much attention to quality. So with the Grand Chantier des Familles, and in order to create new spaces rapidly, one strategy that the government has done is to increase the number of children per facility from 80 to 100. The process to open a CPE has also been streamlined. What is really concerning is that the government has allowed the integration of non-legally recognized and unlicensed childcare service into the formal network. The idea being that we wanted to have a better picture of the actual number of spaces that are being offered, but at the same time, this means integrating potentially low-quality sectors into the formal network. So who owns childcare in Quebec? Well, for-profit centers, unfortunately, have taken an increasing share of spaces since 2003, and there's no indication of a change in direction. Is Quebec the model to follow? That breaks my heart because I'm from Quebec, and we are very proud of our family policy. We have a very strong feminist movement in Quebec, and I think Quebec is definitely the model to follow in terms of, I want to say something positive because I need to say something positive, otherwise I feel like a traitor. So so we are definitely the model to follow in terms of parental benefit, because we have like great paternity benefits, men take them. We're doing great. In terms of childcare, not that much. And for all the reasons I explained, like most childcare spaces are not offered by the for-profit sectors. Waiting lists are long, even though the government has been creating childcare spaces. The waiting lists are not moving, so something is happening. And also, fully trained childcare workers are now being replaced by untrained childcare workers, educators, I should say. Thank you.